In Darktide, your melee weapon is super important. We have lots of skills, abilities, and talents to choose from, but oftentimes the defining part of a build comes down to which blade you choose to wield. Your melee options, so much more so than your ranged, deeply impact how your character plays and interacts with enemies. And while Darktide has a pretty impressive and varied arsenal, there are a number of weapons from the 40k universe that players really want to see represented in Darktide. So here's my 5 most wanted melee weapons for 2026. At number 5, I gotta go with shield and X weapon combos. I say X because there are a number of weapons that would pair very well with a shield in this game. Of course, we've already got the Ogren with his Battle Maul and Slab Shield. We've also got the RBs with the Shock Maul and Shield. So these weapons are really awesome. They have a combination of single target strike down hits with the actual mace themselves, and then you've got the shield for like wide ranging, wide sweeping destruction, and of course shoving. And in the case of the RBD shield, it even has like that flashbang special effect. So there's some really cool stuff they can do with shields. However, I think as far as shields go in the game so far, they're kind of overrepresented with just a blunt weapon, just a big chunk of metal in your other hand. If they paired that with some bladed weapons instead, one in particular that I would be very keen to see would be the Tack Axe with a shield. The Tack Axe is a very, very high efficiency DPS weapon. Its one downside is that enemies don't get staggered by it, so then they get aggressive on you and you need to dodge away. Well, what if you paired it with a block weapon, and now you can go aggro with the Tack Axe and then simply put up your block and go into a defensive mode when they go to retaliate. And then you could use that shield to deal with larger packs of enemies that can swarm around you and make some space for yourself. Another classic combination that you can see in games like Space Marine 2 is the Chainsword plus shield that is on the Bulwark. That would be an awesome selection, because a lot of times the Chainsword leaves you open to a punish by enemies as soon as you finish, but if you can just block and get yourself out of danger, we would love to see something like that. And then as far as weapons that aren't represented in the game currently being paired up with a shield, I think the most classic combo that many players would want to see would be a flail and shield. Pretty much exactly what Warrior Priest Saltspire had in Vermintide 2. The flail is just such an awesome weapon in that game, and of course that weapon would have to go to our resident Warrior Priest in this game, the Zealot. As far as a Tack Axe or a Chainsword and Shield, I could see the Veteran wielding these. I could certainly see the RBDs wielding these because he has access to the Tack Axe already. I don't think this would be appropriate really for Psyker, but perhaps even our new class could wield something like this. I just think that we need to see at least the Zealot getting his hands on a shield and melee weapon combo, since this is a melee focused character that is missing one of the coolest weapon combos that is available in Darktide. Number 4 is a weapon for the Psyker. The Psyker is not exactly a melee focused character, although lately melee Psykers have been going absolutely bonkers with Force Greatsword, but there are a number of weapons in the universe that could be used by Psykers in melee, and a lot of them come down to that Force weapon prefix. As we have the Force Sword and the Force Greatsword already, but there are also Force Axes, Force Hammers, and in fact even my pick for number 4, the Force Spear. The Force Spear is typically an Eldari weapon, although there is some hints that there might be Eldars kind of in the proximity of the Morningstar that could be a potential narrative inclusion in the future. But even if they don't, I think there could be some lore bending, some lore justification to excuse how such a weapon would be included in the Psyker's arsenal. Now, as far as what this weapon does, I think it would represent a very different weapon to how a lot of Darktide plays currently, since there are no weapons currently that outrange melee enemies, excepting I think maybe like the very, very long Relic Blade and Force Greatsword can reach, but having a thrusting weapon with a long reach like that, similar to the Billhook or the Corellian's Spear from Vermintide 2, those weapons allowed you to poke at enemies and keep a safe distance. Now, in the case of the Force Spear, it actually has one additional thing that it can do that is very, very cool, and it can actually be hurled as a range weapon and then recalled to your hand using your psychokinetic forces. So imagining throwing this weapon out into an enemy and then using some peril, generating peril, and ripping it out of enemies, perhaps dealing damage or applying bleeds, and then returning it to your hand to be thrown again. That sort of thing I could see being very, very cool in Darktide, and really creating a melee playstyle that has a hybridization between melee and ranged on one weapon, which would be just an awesome thing to see and watch other players wield and wield yourself. So definitely very keen to see something like that represented in Darktide. And speaking of weapons with a much longer than normal reach, at number 3 is the Chain Glaive. The Chain Glaive is exactly what it sounds like. A glaive being a long staff style weapon with a blade, usually a fixed blade at the end, and the Chain Glaive just replacing that blade with a chain weapon. So you've got yourself like a 6 to 8 foot haft, and then you've got a chainsword just kind of hanging out up there. Now there are different variants on chain glaives. You can have, in fact, a like chain axe, like sort of a chain halberd style, or you can have a chain sword up there. Either way, generally the way these weapons fight is they have long sort of sweeping arc strikes that keep enemies at bay. Lighter enemies get sawn apart by this, but when you come across a more armored enemy or formidable enemy that you want to keep at arm's reach as you deal that rev damage, you rev the sword up and then you thrust it into them and you keep them at that distance as you do that sawing action. Now this would be so much better than what we currently have in the game for these chain weapons, because as I said previously, one of the big vulnerabilities of these weapons is that in order to do your special action and do that chain ripping damage, you need to get yourself right up close and personal, basically be inside of the enemies as you do it. With this weapon, you'd be able to keep that distance and therefore keep enemies from surrounding you while you did it. Although this weapon is going to be far less mobile than those would, and probably just want to have it deal less damage overall because it is a smaller chain weapon at the end of a long pole. It would be too hard. A lot of times Astartes and Space Marine Legions, they use these as full-size chain swords at the end of big long stabs, and that would probably just be too unwieldy for most of our cast to muscle about. But this weapon would be a really, really great fit for, I think a lot of the humanoid characters could pull this up. I think even Psychers have been seen with these in tabletop, but yeah, Zealot would be the obvious choice here. Also RBDs, I could see Veteran perhaps pulling it off, but really just any sort of long range weapon like that. And I think this is just the most 40k weapon. You could take a spear or a halberd and and convert it into what our rejects might end up using. So definitely would be a cool idea to see something long reach like that. In the runner-up spot, my second favorite pick for a weapon to come to Darktide, this is an Ogryn weapon, and just like in my ranking list of the 5 range weapons I want to see in Darktide, this is also a weapon that enemies in game already have. And of course, if you know those two things, it's on Ogryn and it's an enemy weapon, you already know what it is, right? It's the Crusher's Maul. The Crusher has a maul that comes in a variety of flavors. It has concrete and rebar, or rock with metal plates bolted onto it, both of which deal equal damage, but those would be very, very cool ways to skin it up so that the you'd make some microtransaction sales in the store. Fat Shark, you're welcome for the idea. I'll take a small commission for that. But this weapon has its moveset already laid out, and honestly, the way it's laid out for the Crusher to use it in-game, I think would be quite perfect for its representation for our character, or at least something very simple, right? So there are 6 moves that the Crushers can use, but 3 of them are the ones that really stand out to me here. The first is the sideways sweep. He does a quick sweep, and he can hit enemies around him in sort of a small cone in front of him, and it comes out fairly quickly. That will be your light attack. Then you've of course got the butt of the weapon, where you hit with the haft and it knocks the enemies back. If you get hit by this in game, it knocks you back and it slows you for a second. This would be the push, or the push attack, that could knock these enemies back and daze them. And then, of course, the follow-up on that is the coup de grace, right? The Crusher move, which is the overhead, the 10-ton hammer that you're going to come crashing down them with. We, of course, already have a weapon that does a similar style of strike down to this, which is the Branks pickaxe, but that weapon does not achieve the fantasy of what I want to accomplish here, right? The Branks pickaxe does an overhead strike down, but it is a fine point. It is a single target murderer. It hits one target and pierces armor and does a bajillion damage to just them. I want this attack to do a small AoE. I want all of the attacks in this weapon to cleave and hit enemies in a small area. I want this to be a very destructive weapon, as it is a hammer. I don't want to end up with a second Thunder Hammer where your strike down attacks hit only one enemy. Remember, instead of swinging a hammer that has a head that's only about 4 inches wide. We're instead swinging a hammer that has a ball of concrete with a diameter of 2 feet. So this is going to hit many more enemies than the ones that are directly impacted. In fact, I could even foresee a situation where it would in fact hit hit the ground and cause enemies around it to be staggered as a blessing or something. Of course, the blessings for this would pair very well with things like Thrust, perhaps even Slaughterer, as we see on Thunder, Hammer, and Crusher. So those sort of blessings work really well here. I just definitely think that there's a lot of desire out there for Ogryns to have more melee arsenal. And one of the things that is not very explored is two-handed absolute smashing tools. So let's get it going, Fat Shark. And my number 1 pick, the thing that I want to see for a melee addition to Darktide the most of all, is actually 2 different things. I'm going to double up on this pick, guys. It's like 1.5 items here, but they both kind of revolve around the same theme. The weapon I am talking about is the Power Fist. And I mean, it's exactly what it sounds like. If you don't know what a Power Fist is, perhaps you played Space Marine 2, you've seen it there. That is an Astartes sort of classed Power Fist, right? It's a massive, massive fuck-off gauntlet that can just absolutely pulp everything in front of it with a huge wave of energy, but they make them smaller. They make them in the size that members of the Astra Militarum can use. Oftentimes it's like captains and commanders that are wielding these things because they are quite pricey, but they allow you to get up close and personal and become a pugilist, to get into the enemy's face and just give them the uppercut to the chin, to just punch them in the throat or slam them in the chest and send them reeling backwards. And I think one thing that Fat Shark does really, really well with weapons is they nail the visceral feeling of landing a concussive blow on the enemy, right? When you actually hit with the Thunder Hammer, despite the Thunder Hammer kind of sucking a lot of times, it really does have that oomph to it, and that's why I would love to see their take on a Power Fist. Now, I said that I was going to make this kind of a double up, and the reason I'm saying that is because the Ogryn 100% should get a Power Fist equivalent, although I think a Power Fist on an Ogryn would actually just like completely gap every enemy in the game. Like, it would just absolutely be way overpowered lore-wise. But if you just gave the Ogryn some brass knuckles and just send him to town, that would be a very, very formidable melee weapon indeed for him, because Ogryns are like chimpanzees, right? They'll rip your limbs off if you look at them wrong. They have that sort of innate strength to them. And so if you give the Ogryn just, some spiked brass knuckles and just point him towards the enemies, he'll go out there and he'll beat them to death with his almost bare hands. And that's something I would love to see for the Ogryn. We've got weapons that kind of approximate that. We've got, daggers, the Ogryn cleavers that can have uppercuts and stuff like that. But take that all the way and have the Ogryn's uppercuts and shoves and punches and crushes be the weapon. And the really cool thing to imagine about this is that Darktide already has a system in place where enemies, when they enter into each other's space and are moving, they can bump each other out of animation. So if you've ever seen a trapper who's winding up for a shot and a mutant runs through them, it'll knock the trapper to the ground. Or a dog jumps by a gunner as they're shooting, it'll interrupt the gunner and knock him to the side. Those sort of animations, or those sort of actions, tells you that there is a system in place where certain enemies can be coded to shove, and that means if you gave the Ogryn or a Power Fist user the ability to just shove enemies bodily, or even in the Ogryn's case, pick up an enemy as a human shield and hurl them into a group, you could have everything around them get knocked back and damaged. So I would love to see a pugilist sort of archetype in the game where you're getting up close and personal, you're getting your knuckles bloody, and you're just hurling around the foes, because I think that a lot of people's fantasy of Ogryn, of Zealot, is just getting as up close and visceral as possible, and this would be the ultimate conclusion of that, is just literally ripping your enemy apart limb from limb and bludgeoning them to death with your nearly bare hands. So very cool stuff. And I do think, if I were to go back and review the list here, I do think a lot of these are very foreseeable. I think the one that I would guess is almost destined to come out at some point is a shield plus a weapon combo, especially for Zealot, since we've already got it on the RPDs and the Ogryn at this point. It would make no sense to me if we didn't see that on the Zealot, given they've added some new blocking talents for him. But we've also just got so many options in the 40k universe. I definitely think that they should be going down the route of looking for some weapons that are very much akin to what they were using in Vermintide 2, with those glaive weapons, with the halberds, for reach weapons. Even if they don't go for a chain glaive, they could just go for straight up like spears and just keep just regular halberds. Those still exist in the 40k universe, but they'd be a little bit less flashy than the chain glaive, of course. And when you're going to make a new weapon, you want it to be flashy, right? But that's everything, guys. Let me know in the comments if there was anything that you thought would be really, really cool and would stand out as an inclusion in 40k. I tried to hit all the ones that I see people asking about all the times and the ones that I thought were the coolest. But maybe I'll make another video if we get enough cool ideas. And thanks for watching, guys. Remember to like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.